Welcome, seekers of the untamed night. Tonight, you'll witness the awakening of a woman whose blood carries the echoes of ancient magic, a librarian who thought her greatest power was organizing dusty tomes until the night her touch set fire to shadows themselves. A prophecy written in starlight, a bloodline thought extinct, and an alpha whose very soul recognizes her before his mind can comprehend. This is not merely a tale of love. This is the birth of a queen who will reshape the supernatural world forever. Chapter 1. The Whispering Pages. The old leather binding cracked beneath Seraphina Cross's fingertips, and for a heartbeat, she could have sworn she heard it scream. She jerked her hands back from the ancient tome, her pulse quickening as she stared down at the midnight blue cover. The Georgetown University Library's rare books section was silent around her, bathed in the amber glow of antique reading lamps. At nearly midnight, she was alone with thousands of sleeping stories, exactly how she preferred it. Just old leather, she whispered to herself, pushing a strand of copper hair behind her ear. But her emerald eyes remained fixed on the book, watching for what? Movement? The impossible shimmer she thought she'd glimpsed across its surface? Seraphina had been the night curator for 3 years, and books didn't frighten her. They were her sanctuary, her escape from a world that had never quite felt like home. But this particular volume, Chronicles of the Moonborn, had arrived in yesterday's donation without any paperwork, any history. It simply appeared on her desk with a note, "For the one who remembers." She reached for it again, more carefully this time. The moment her skin made contact with the leather, warmth spread up her arms like liquid fire. The library around her seemed to pulse, shadows dancing at the edges of her vision. Words began to glow on the open page before her. Not ink, but actual light bleeding through the parchment. When the blood of the first awakens, the moon itself will bow to her call. The temperature in the room plummeted. Her breath misted in the suddenly frigid air, and every instinct screamed at her to run. Instead, she found herself leaning closer, drawn by a force she couldn't name. The glowing text shifted, rearranging itself as she watched. Seraphina of the Silver Flame, daughter of prophecy, your time of hiding is over. Her gasp echoed through the vast space. The book knew her name. Impossible, terrifying, but undeniably real. As she stared at the impossible words, a new presence filled the library, something wild and powerful, making the air thick with an energy that raised every hair on her body. She wasn't alone anymore. Footsteps approached from the darkness between the stacks, measured and predatory. A man emerged from the shadows, and Seraphina's world tilted on its axis. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with midnight black hair and eyes like molten gold. Everything about him radiated controlled power, from the way he moved with fluid grace to the subtle way the air itself seemed to bend around him. "You shouldn't be here," she managed, though her voice came out breathless rather than authoritative. "Neither should you." His voice was deep, rough velvet that sent shivers down her spine. "Not at this hour, not with that book, and definitely not alone." Those golden eyes locked onto the glowing tome, and his expression shifted from wariness to something approaching reverence and fear. "How long has it been speaking to you?" "Speaking? It's just," but the lie died on her lips as she looked down. The pages were now covered in flowing script that definitely hadn't been there minutes ago, writing itself in that same ethereal light. Her heart hammered against her ribs. "What's happening to me?" He stepped closer, and she caught his scent, pine, leather, and something wild that made her pulse spike. "My name is Kieran Nightshade, and I've been searching for you for a very long time." "Searching for me? But you don't even know me." The smile that curved his lips was equal parts dangerous and devastating. "I know you're the woman who's been calling to every supernatural creature within a 100-mile radius in your sleep for the past month. I know your dreams have been filled with silver fire and howling winds. And I know that book has been waiting 3 centuries for you to touch it." Seraphina's knees went weak. The dreams he described were real, vivid, nightly visions that left her exhausted and aching with longing for something she couldn't name. But how could this stranger possibly know about them? "You're insane," she whispered, But even as the words left her mouth, the book in her hands began to levitate, pages flipping on their own. Kieran's eyes flashed, literally flashed, gold becoming liquid flame for an instant. And you're not entirely human. The question is, are you ready to learn what you really are? The book suddenly burst into silver flames that didn't burn, and Seraphina's world exploded into light and impossible truth. Chapter 2. The Silver Flame Awakens. The flames didn't hurt. They caressed her skin like warm silk, wrapping around her arms in spirals of liquid starlight. But the visions that crashed into her mind were anything but gentle. She saw herself standing atop a mountain beneath a blood-red moon, silver fire pouring from her fingertips as wolves the size of horses bowed at her feet. She saw ancient ceremonies in moonlit groves, women with her face calling down lightning from clear skies. She saw a great war, darkness consuming everything until a figure wreathed in silver light, herself, drove it back with power that made the earth itself tremble. "Breathe, Seraphina." Kieran's voice cut through the chaos, strong hands gripping her shoulders. "Don't fight the awakening. Let it flow through you." She gasped, the visions fracturing as she focused on his golden eyes. The flames around her hands flickered, but didn't die. "What am I?" "You're the last daughter of the Silver Moon bloodline," he said, his voice filled with an awe that made her stomach flutter. "The most powerful lunar witch lineage ever born. Your ancestors were the bridge between the human world and ours. They could command not just wolves, but all creatures of the night." The book in her hands had transformed, its pages now made of what looked like hammered moonlight. Words continued to write themselves across its surface, but now she could read them as easily as English. They told of her great-grandmother, Elena Silvermoon, who had hidden among humans to escape those who would use her power, who had bound her bloodline, ensuring her descendants would live normal lives. Until now. "The binding is breaking," Kieran continued, studying her face intently. "That's why I've been able to track you. Your power signature has been growing stronger every night." "But I don't want power," Seraphina said, though even as the words left her mouth, part of her thrilled at the silver flames dancing between her fingers. "I just want my quiet life back." Kieran's expression softened, and he reached up to cup her cheek. The moment his skin touched hers, the flames flared brighter, and she felt something click into place deep in her chest, a recognition so profound it stole her breath. "I know, little witch, but wanting and choosing are two different things. And right now, you need to choose quickly."
"Why?"
"What's the rush?" His golden eyes darkened. "Because you're not the only one who felt your awakening tonight. Every supernatural creature for miles knows exactly where you are, and not all of them have good intentions." As if summoned by his words, a low growl echoed through the library. Then another. And another. Seraphina spun toward the windows, her enhanced senses suddenly picking up movement in the shadows outside, shapes too large to be human, eyes that reflected the amber lamplight like mirrors. "Rogues," Kieran snarled, and this time she heard something inhuman in his voice. "They hunt awakening witches, drain their power before they can learn to defend themselves." The main door to the library rattled, then exploded inward in a shower of splinters. 3 massive wolves padded through the entrance, their fur matted and their eyes glowing red with hunger. But these weren't normal wolves. They were twice the size, with intelligence gleaming in those crimson depths and saliva that steamed when it hit the floor. "Stay behind me," Kieran commanded, but Seraphina was already moving. The silver flames around her hands roared to life, responding to her fear and fury. One of the creatures lunged toward them, and without thinking, she thrust her palm forward. A lance of pure silver fire erupted from her hand, catching the rogue wolf mid-leap and sending it crashing into the far wall. The scent of burned fur and something fouler filled the air. The remaining 2 wolves crouched low, hackles raised, reassessing their prey. "Impossible." One of them spoke, its voice a gravelly rasp that sounded wrong coming from a wolf's throat. "She's untrained. The power should be wild, uncontrolled." Kieran moved in front of her, and his form began to shift. Bones cracked and reformed, his clothing shredding as his human shape gave way to something far more dangerous. Within seconds, a wolf the size of a small horse stood where he had been, but this creature was nothing like the rogues. His fur was midnight black shot through with silver, his eyes still that molten gold, and power radiated from him like heat from a forge. The Alpha. Even in her confusion and terror, some deep part of her recognized what he was. The two remaining rogues exchanged glances, suddenly less confident. The larger one spoke again. The Nightshade Alpha protects her. This changes nothing. She's still too valuable to leave alive. They attacked in perfect synchronization, one leaping toward Kieran while the other circled wide toward Seraphina. She raised her hands instinctively, silver fire blooming around her like protective petals. But this time, something more happened. The flames didn't just form around her. They connected to every shadow in the library, turning them into extensions of her will. Ancient books lifted from their shelves, swirling around her in a tornado of knowledge and power. The very air sang with energy, and for one terrifying, exhilarating moment, she felt like she could reshape reality itself. The rogue wolf charging toward her slammed into an invisible barrier and collapsed whimpering. Kieran made short work of his opponent, powerful jaws crushing bone with sickening efficiency. But as quickly as it had come, the surge of power vanished. Seraphina stumbled, exhaustion crashing over her like a physical weight. The books tumbled to the floor around her, and the silver flames flickered out. Kieran shifted back to human form, magnificently naked and apparently unconcerned about it, as he rushed to her side. "Are you hurt?" "I don't think so," she managed, though her hands were shaking. "Did I just command shadows, levitate objects, and create protective barriers?" "Yes." His smile was fierce and proud. "That was amazing, Seraphina. And terrifying. You just performed magic that should take years to master." The book in her hands, now returned to its leather binding, grew warm against her palms. New words appeared on the open page. The blood remembers what the mind forgets. But with great power comes great hunger in those who would claim it. A chill ran down her spine that had nothing to do with the library's shattered door. "What does that mean?" Kieran's expression grew grim. "It means tonight was just the beginning. Word of your awakening will spread, and these rogues were nothing compared to what's coming." He pulled a long coat from somewhere and wrapped it around his shoulders before taking her hands in his. "I know this is overwhelming, but I need you to listen carefully. You can't go back to your old life. It's not safe, for you or for anyone around you. So, what are you suggesting? Come with me. Let me take you somewhere safe, somewhere you can learn to control your power properly." Seraphina looked around at the destroyed library, at the bodies of the creatures that had tried to kill her, at the evidence of magic she could no longer deny. Her quiet, ordinary life was over. The question was, what would take its place? "If I go with you," she said slowly, "what exactly am I agreeing to?" His golden eyes burned with an intensity that made her breath catch. "To learn what you really are, to claim your birthright, and to stand beside an alpha who would burn the world down before letting anyone harm you." The promise in his voice sent heat spiraling through her chest. But beneath the attraction, beneath the fear and confusion, a deeper truth was emerging. She could feel it in her bones, in the silver fire still flickering faintly beneath her skin. This was her destiny, had always been her destiny. She was just beginning to understand how dangerous that made her. Chapter 3. Into the Shadow Realm. The motorcycle's engine purred beneath Seraphina like a caged predator as they raced through the empty Washington, D.C. streets. Dawn was still hours away, and the city felt different now, alive with hidden currents she'd never noticed before. Every shadow seemed deeper. Every alley held mysteries that whispered her name. "Where are we going?" she called over the wind, her arms wrapped around Kieran's leather-clad torso. The contact sent electric sparks through her system that had nothing to do with her awakening magic. "Somewhere the rogues can't follow," he replied, taking a sharp turn that made her press closer against his back. "My territory has protections." They'd left the library in flames, literally. Her silver fire had spread to consume the evidence of their battle, leaving nothing but ash and confused human authorities who would blame faulty wiring. The ancient book now rested in her messenger bag, its weight both comforting and terrifying. As they rode deeper into the Virginia countryside, the modern world fell away. Ancient trees pressed close to the road, their branches forming a canopy so thick it blocked out the stars. The air grew heavy with a scent of pine, moss, and something wild that made her newly awakened senses sing. "Kieran," she said suddenly, a chill racing down her spine. "We're not alone." He slowed the bike, golden eyes scanning the treeline. "You can sense them? There." She pointed to their left, where pairs of glowing eyes watched from between the massive oaks. "And there. They're following us." "My pack," he confirmed, and she heard the pride in his voice. "They've been tracking us since we crossed into Nightshade lands. You're quite the sensation, little witch." The bike crested a hill, and Seraphina's breath caught in her throat. Spread before them was a valley that seemed untouched by time, bathed in ethereal moonlight that was too bright, too silver to be natural. At its center stood a mansion that belonged in a fairy tale, all Gothic spires and elegant archways, with towers that spiraled toward the star-drunk sky. "Welcome to Raven's Hollow," Kieran said, and the reverence in his voice made her stomach flutter. "The heart of Nightshade territory. Your new home." As they approached the mansion, figures emerged from the shadows to line their path. Wolves in human form, she realized, though each one radiated power that made her skin prickle. Men and women of all ages, but all sharing the same predatory grace, the same gold-flecked eyes that marked them as pack. The bike came to a stop before the grand entrance, and Kieran dismounted with fluid grace before offering his hand to help her down. The moment her feet touched the ground, the assembled pack members dropped to one knee in perfect unison. "Rise," Kieran commanded, his voice carrying an alpha's authority that made the air itself vibrate. "This is Seraphina Cross, last daughter of the Silver Moon line. She is under my protection." An older woman stepped forward, her silver hair gleaming like moonlight. Despite her apparent age, she moved with the lethal grace of a predator, and power radiated from her like heat from a fire. "My Alpha," she said, inclining her head respectfully to Kieran before turning those penetrating golden eyes to Seraphina. "I am Morgana Blackthorn, the pack's eldest and keeper of the old ways. We have long awaited your awakening, child of silver flame." "You knew about me?" Seraphina asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Morgana's smile was both kind and knowing. "Your bloodline has been connected to ours for over 3 centuries. When the Silver Moon witches were hunted to near extinction, it was the Nightshade pack that offered them sanctuary. Your great-great-grandmother Elena bore her daughter here, in this very house." The ancient book in Seraphina's bag grew warm, and she could swear she heard it humming with approval. "My ancestor lived here?" "More than lived," Kieran said, his hand finding the small of her back in a gesture that sent heat spiraling through her core. "She was mated to my great-great-grandfather. Witch and wolf, bound by love and destiny. The alliance forged between our bloodlines has protected both our peoples ever since." Seraphina's knees went weak. "Mated. The supernatural world is built on such bonds," Morgana explained gently. "When a witch and an alpha find their true match, the connection transcends simple attraction. It becomes a merging of souls, of power itself." The older woman's eyes moved between Seraphina and Kieran, and her smile turned knowing. "But perhaps that is a conversation for after you've had time to rest and process tonight's revelations." As if summoned by her words, exhaustion crashed over Seraphina like a physical weight. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the attack and their flight was fading, leaving her shaky and overwhelmed. "Come," Kieran said, noticing her pallor. "Let me show you to your room." He led her through corridors lined with portraits of fierce-looking men and women, their eyes seeming to track her movement. The mansion was a maze of elegant rooms and hidden passages, but everywhere she looked, she saw evidence of the supernatural: silver weapons mounted on walls, crystals that pulsed with inner light, tapestries that seemed to shift and move when she wasn't looking directly at them. This wing belonged to Elena, Kieran explained as they climbed a spiral staircase. My grandfather kept it exactly as she left it, said it was waiting for her descendant to return. He stopped before an ornate door carved with symbols that made her silver flames flicker beneath her skin. Your flames recognize the protective wards, he observed with interest. They were keyed to Silvermoon blood. The room beyond was breathtaking, all flowing curtains and antique furniture, with a massive canopy bed draped in silver silk. But what drew her attention was the wall of windows that looked out over the valley, showing her a view of the packlands that stretched to the horizon. It's beautiful, she breathed. Not as beautiful as you, Kieran said softly, and when she turned to look at him, the intensity in his golden eyes made her heart race. He stepped closer, and she could feel the heat radiating from his skin, could smell his intoxicating scent of pine and leather and something uniquely him. Seraphina, what happened tonight in the library? The mate bond, she whispered, the words falling from her lips before she could stop them. His pupils dilated, and she saw his hands clench into fists at his sides. You feel it too. It wasn't a question, but she nodded anyway. The connection between them was undeniable, a pulse so strong it felt like gravity itself, drawing her toward him with irresistible force. But you barely know me, she protested, even as every cell in her body screamed at her to close the distance between them. I know enough. His voice was rough with restrained hunger. I know you're brave enough to face down rogues to protect yourself. I know your power calls to mine like a missing piece of my soul. And I know that the thought of anyone else touching you makes my wolf want to tear the world apart. Heat pooled low in her belly at the possessiveness in his tone. But before she could respond, a new voice interrupted them. How touching, came a silky purr from the doorway. The legendary Nightshade Alpha, brought to his knees by a little lost witch. They spun to find a woman lounging against the doorframe with predatory grace. She was stunning in a dangerous way, all sharp cheekbones and midnight hair, with eyes like chips of ice. Everything about her radiated barely contained violence. Lydia, Kieran growled, and Seraphina didn't miss the way his body shifted subtly, placing himself between her and the newcomer. Hello, darling, Lydia purred, her gaze flicking dismissively over Seraphina before returning to Kieran with hungry intensity. I heard you'd brought home a stray. I thought I should welcome her properly. You're not welcome here, Kieran said, his voice carrying alpha command. Lydia laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Oh, but I think I am. You see, the Council of Alphas has some very interesting questions about your little pet. Questions about bloodline claims, about ancient treaties, about whether she's truly stable enough to wield Silvermoon power. I settled in Seraphina's stomach. What does that mean? It means, little witch, Lydia said with a predatory smile, that your awakening has attracted attention from powers far greater than a few rogue wolves. The Council will want to test you, to determine if you're an asset or a threat to the supernatural order. She pushed off from the doorframe and sauntered closer, circling them like a shark scenting blood. And if they decide you're too dangerous to live, well, alpha protection only goes so far. Kieran's form began to shimmer, the threat of his transformation making the air itself vibrate with power. But before he could shift, silver flames erupted around Seraphina's hands, not the controlled fire from earlier, but wild, chaotic energy that responded to her fear and fury. The flames reached toward Lydia, and the other woman's eyes widened as she stumbled backward. Impossible. She shouldn't be able to. The silver fire suddenly exploded outward, filling the room with blinding light. When it faded, every piece of furniture was covered in a layer of frost, and intricate patterns of ice covered the windows. Seraphina stared at her hands in horror. That wasn't fire magic. That was something else entirely. Well, Lydia said, her voice pitched with sudden fear and excitement. This changes everything. Chapter 4. The Council's Shadow. The frost covering the windows began to melt at first light, creating rivulets that looked disturbingly like tears against the glass. Seraphina sat in the window seat, watching the Nightshade pack move through their morning routines in the valley below, trying to process everything that had happened in the past 12 hours. Her life had become a supernatural fairy tale, complete with an alpha who made her blood sing and powers that defied explanation. The ancient book lay open in her lap, its pages now showing detailed illustrations of women who looked remarkably like her, wielding both fire and ice with devastating precision. "The duality gift," she read aloud, tracing the elegant script with one finger. "Born to the rarest of Silvermoon daughters, the power to command both flame and frost marks the herald of a new age." "Cheerful reading material," came Kieran's voice from the doorway. He entered carrying a silver tray laden with food that smelled like heaven, and despite everything, her stomach growled loudly enough to make him smile. "When did you last eat?" he asked, setting the tray on the small table beside her. "Yesterday, sometime." She accepted the cup of coffee he offered, inhaling the rich aroma gratefully. "I don't suppose any of this is normal food? No magical wolf supplements or enchanted berries?" His laugh was rich and warm. "Just bacon, eggs, and toast. Though the coffee beans are grown in soil blessed by moon rituals, so there's that." Despite her anxiety, she found herself smiling back. There was something so reassuring about his presence, as if his mere proximity made the impossible chaos of her new reality seem manageable. "About last night," she began, but he raised a hand to stop her. "Lydia's dramatic entrance aside, you handled your first power surge remarkably well. Most newly awakened witches level entire buildings when their abilities manifest. Is that supposed to make me feel better?" She took a bite of perfectly crispy bacon, surprised by how hungry she actually was. "And who exactly is Lydia? Besides someone who clearly has history with you." Kieran's expression darkened. "She's the alpha of the Shadowmere pack and my former associate." Associate. The word came out sharper than she'd intended, and she felt heat flicker beneath her skin. The jealous fire of the mate bond, she realized with shock. "We were betrothed," he said simply, and her coffee cup cracked in her grip. Steam rose from the break, but whether from heat or cold, she couldn't tell. "It was a political alliance arranged by the Council of Alphas when we were children. But that was before." "Before what?" His golden eyes met hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Before I knew what it felt like to find my true mate." The broken coffee cup began to glow with silver light, mending itself as she watched. Magic responding to emotion. Apparently that was going to be a theme in her new life. "The council won't be pleased about the broken engagement," she said quietly. "The council can go to hell." His voice carried the rough edge of his wolf, and she felt an answering wildness rise in her chest. "I've spent my entire life following their rules, making decisions based on pack politics and ancient treaties. But some things are more important than politics." Before she could respond, rapid footsteps echoed in the hallway. Morgana appeared in the doorway, her usually composed expression tight with worry. "My alpha," she said formally, which immediately put Seraphina on edge. "We have a problem. The Council of Alphas has called an emergency session. They want to see the Silvermoon heir within the week." Kieran was on his feet instantly, his body radiating dangerous energy. "They can't enforce a summons on someone outside pack hierarchy. They can if they classify her as a potential threat to supernatural stability." Morgana's ancient eyes moved to Seraphina with sympathy. "I'm sorry, child, but news of your dual gift has already reached them. They're invoking the doctrine of magical oversight." The book in Seraphina's lap suddenly slammed shut with enough force to make her jump. When she opened it again, the pages were filled with new text, writing itself in urgent, flowing script. "When fire and frost unite in one vessel, the old powers tremble. For she who commands both destruction and preservation holds the key to reshaping the supernatural realm itself. The council fears what they cannot control, and they will not hesitate to eliminate what they cannot bind." "That's comforting," Seraphina muttered, but her hands were shaking as she read the warning. "What exactly is the doctrine of magical oversight?" Kieran demanded. Morgana's expression grew even grimmer. It allows the Council to test any supernatural being whose power could potentially destabilize the existing order. If they determine the individual is too dangerous. She didn't need to finish the sentence. They'll try to kill me, Seraphina said flatly. Not if I have anything to say about it, Kieran growled, and the windows rattled with the force of his barely contained power. Kieran, you can't fight the entire council, Morgana warned. There are 12 alphas on the ruling body, each commanding hundreds of pack members. Even your strength has limits. Then we run, he said without hesitation. Take her somewhere they can't reach. Where? Seraphina asked, though part of her was already standing, ready to flee into the morning with him. If they have that much power, is anywhere really safe? The ancient book grew warm in her hands again, and new words appeared. Safety lies not in hiding, but in claiming what is rightfully yours. The Silvermoon Sanctuary awaits its true heir. What sanctuary? She asked aloud, but the book had gone silent again. Morgana's eyes widened as she caught sight of the text. The Silvermoon Sanctuary. I thought it was just legend. A fortress built by your ancestors, hidden from all but those of pure Silvermoon blood. If it exists, we need to find it, Kieran said immediately. How long before the council summons becomes a hunting party? 3 days, perhaps 4, Morgana replied. But Alpha, if you defy a direct council order, I'll be branded rogue and hunted alongside her. Kieran shrugged as if the prospect of becoming an outlaw didn't concern him in the least. So be it. The casual way he was willing to sacrifice everything for her made Seraphina's chest tighten with emotion. I can't let you do that. Your pack needs you. My pack needs their Lunamore, he said, and the possessive intensity in his voice made heat pool low in her belly. Besides, you underestimate your own importance. If the legends are true, if you really can command both elements with equal strength, you could reshape the balance of power in the supernatural world. I don't want to reshape anything, she protested. I just want to understand what's happening to me. Sometimes what we want and what destiny demands are two different things, Morgana said gently. But perhaps understanding will come with training. Your powers are raw, untamed. With proper guidance, you could be unstoppable, came Lydia's voice from the hallway. She sauntered into the room without invitation, her ice-blue eyes fixed on Seraphina with calculating hunger. Which is exactly what has the council so frightened. What do you want, Lydia? Kieran positioned himself between them again, and Seraphina felt a surge of gratitude for his protection. To make a deal, Lydia said with a predatory smile. The council has authorized me to offer terms for the little witch's surrender. Not interested, Seraphina said immediately, but Lydia continued as if she hadn't spoken. Voluntary submission for testing and power binding. In exchange, they'll allow her to live under strict supervision. House arrest, magical dampeners, regular check-ins with council representatives. You mean a cage, Kieran snarled. A very pretty cage, Lydia agreed cheerfully. Gilded bars, comfortable furnishings, and all the books she could want. She'd even be allowed conjugal visits from her mate, eventually. Silver flames erupted around Seraphina's hands before she could stop them, but this time frost didn't follow. Instead, the fire burned hotter, brighter, until the air itself seemed to ignite. Counteroffer, she said, her voice carrying a power she didn't recognize as her own. Tell your council that the last daughter of the Silvermoon line doesn't bow to anyone. Lydia's eyes widened as the temperature in the room spiked, then plummeted, then spiked again. Ice crystals formed in the air around Seraphina's flames, creating a swirling vortex of opposing elements that should have cancelled each other out but instead seemed to feed on their contradiction. This is impossible, Lydia breathed, taking an involuntary step backward. Fire and ice can't coexist like that. It violates the fundamental laws of elemental magic. Then maybe it's time for new laws, Seraphina said, and the ancient book in her lap opened to a page she'd never seen before. The illustration showed a woman standing at the center of a great battlefield, her hands wreathed in flames of silver and blue, while around her feet spread an ocean of crystalline ice. Above her head, storm clouds gathered, and from her eyes poured light that seemed to rewrite reality itself. At the bottom of the page, in script that glowed with its own inner fire, were the words, "When the duality Empress rises, even gods will kneel." The room fell silent except for the crackling of impossible fire and the whisper of forming frost. But in that silence, Seraphina heard something else, the distant sound of howls carried on the wind, growing closer with each passing second. "What is that?" she asked, though some deep instinct already knew the answer. Lydia's predatory smile turned vicious. The council's patience running out. Chapter 5. Blood and Betrayal. The howls were closer now, echoing through the valley with a harmony that spoke of trained hunters working in perfect coordination. Seraphina counted at least a dozen distinct voices, all converging on Raven's Hollow with deadly purpose. "Council enforcers," Morgana said grimly, her ancient features tight with worry. "They move faster than anticipated." Kieran was already shifting into alpha mode, his casual warmth replaced by the cold calculation of a warrior. "How many?" From the sound, at least 2 full hunting packs. Morgana moved to the window, her enhanced senses reading the approaching threat. "They're surrounding the estate. So much for diplomatic negotiations," Lydia said with false sweetness, though Seraphina caught the flicker of genuine surprise in her ice-blue eyes. "The council must be more concerned than they let on." "You didn't know they were coming," Seraphina realized, studying the other woman's face. "This wasn't part of your deal." Lydia's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something that might have been fear. "The council doesn't share all their strategies with individual alphas. Even me." The ancient book in Seraphina's hands began to pulse with warmth, its pages flipping on their own until they settled on a new illustration. This one showed Raven's Hollow itself, but overlaid with glowing lines that formed an intricate geometric pattern. "The estate is built on a convergence point," she read aloud from the text that appeared beneath the image, "where ley lines of earth magic meet and multiply. In times of great need, the sanctuary's heir may call upon this power to defend her people." "Seraphina, no," Kieran said immediately, recognizing the dangerous gleam in her eyes. "You're not ready for that level of magic. It could kill you. And if I don't try, those enforcers will definitely kill us all." She stood, power already beginning to spiral around her in visible currents of air. "Besides, I'm tired of running from fights I didn't start." The howls were in the courtyard now, accompanied by the heavy footsteps of men who had shifted back to human form. Through the frost-covered windows, she could see shapes moving with military precision, surrounding the mansion with practiced efficiency. "Alpha Nightshade," came a booming voice from below. "By order of the Council of Alphas, you will surrender the rogue witch for immediate transport to the testing grounds. Resistance will be met with lethal force." "Over my dead body," Kieran snarled, but Seraphina was already moving toward the window. "That can be arranged," she called down, her voice carrying further than it should have, enhanced by magic she was still learning to control. The enforcers below looked up in surprise, and she felt a savage satisfaction at their shock. She pressed her palms against the ice-covered glass, and immediately the frost began to spread outward in complex spirals. But this wasn't the chaotic explosion from the night before. This was controlled, purposeful, beautiful in its deadly precision. "The ley lines," she whispered, feeling them now like rivers of molten power running beneath the estate. "I can feel them all." "Seraphina, please." Kieran's voice was rough with concern. "This kind of magic, it changes you. The old texts speak of witches who channeled too much earth power and lost themselves to it." "Then you'll have to bring me back," she said simply, turning to meet his golden eyes. In them, she saw her own determination reflected, along with a love so fierce it took her breath away. "That's what mates do, right?" Before he could protest further, she shattered the window with a gesture and stepped onto the wide ledge that ran along the mansion's second floor. The morning air was crisp against her skin, but she no longer felt the cold. Or rather, the cold was part of her now, as much as the fire that danced between her fingers. The enforcers in the courtyard below were imposing figures, all broad shoulders and predatory grace, wearing the black leather and silver insignia of the Council's elite forces. Their leader, a scarred man with graying hair, looked up at her with eyes like chips of granite. "Last warning," which he called. "Surrender now, and your death will be quick." "Counteroffer," Seraphina replied, and let her power unfurl. The ley lines responded to her call, like old friends recognizing a beloved voice. Earth magic rushed up through the foundation of Raven's Hollow, channeling itself through her body and into the air around her. Silver fire erupted from her left hand while her right became wreathed in frost that sparkled with its own inner light. But this time, instead of fighting each other, the opposing elements began to dance. Fire and ice spiraled around her in perfect harmony, creating patterns that hurt to look at directly, as if reality itself was being rewritten by their impossible coexistence. "By all the ancient powers," one of the enforcers breathed, his weapon lowering involuntarily. "She's channeling pure creation force." "Take her down," the leader shouted, but his men hesitated, apparently recognizing power that transcended their understanding. Seraphina raised both hands, and the very air began to sing. Ice crystallized in beautiful, deadly formations while silver flames carved glowing sigils into the morning sky. The ley line power flowed through her like liquid starlight, and for one terrifying, exhilarating moment, she felt like she could reshape the world with a thought. "I am Seraphina Cross, last daughter of the Silver Moon line." Her voice carried impossible authority, enhanced by magic that made the earth itself listen. "And I do not bow to false kings." She brought her hands together, and fire met ice in an explosion of power that should have destroyed everything within 100 yards. Instead, the opposing forces created something entirely new, a wave of energy that swept outward in all directions, touching every living thing in its path. Where it touched the enforcers, they fell to their knees as their wolf forms were forcibly triggered, then immediately suppressed, then triggered again in a cycle that left them writhing in confused agony. Where it touched the trees, flowers bloomed out of season while frost painted the leaves in crystalline beauty. Where it touched the earth, the very ground began to glow with veins of silver light. But the power was too much, too vast for any single person to contain. Seraphina felt herself being stretched thin, her consciousness expanding beyond the boundaries of her physical form. She was the wind, the earth, the fire and ice and everything between. Strong arms wrapped around her from behind, pulling her back from the brink of dissolution. Kieran's scent surrounded her, pine and leather, and something uniquely him, anchoring her to her human form. "Come back to me," he whispered against her ear, his voice rough with desperate love. "Come back to me, Seraphina." The ley line power released her with an almost audible snap, and she collapsed against his chest, exhausted but whole. The courtyard below was in chaos, enforcers struggling to regain their footing while their leaders stared up at her with something approaching awe. "Impossible," Lydia breathed from somewhere behind them. "No one can channel that much raw power and remain human." But Seraphina wasn't entirely human anymore, and they all knew it. The magic had changed her on a fundamental level, awakening something that had been sleeping in her bloodline for generations. She could feel it in her bones, in the way her heart beat in rhythm with the earth's pulse. "The council needs to see this," the enforcer leader called up, his earlier aggression replaced by careful respect. "Alpha Nightshade, I formally request safe passage to withdraw and report to our superiors." "Granted," Kieran replied without hesitation. "But make sure they understand, any future attempts to take my mate will be met with far less restraint." As the enforcers began their tactical retreat, Seraphina noticed that Lydia had gone very quiet. The other Alpha stood in the doorway, her ice-blue eyes fixed on the glowing ley line patterns that still pulsed faintly through the estate's foundation. "You know something," Seraphina said, reading the calculating expression on Lydia's face. "What aren't you telling us?" Lydia's smile was sharp as a blade. "Just that the council's real concern isn't your power, little witch. It's what that power represents. The return of the duality bloodline means the old treaties are void, the old hierarchies meaningless." She stepped closer, and Seraphina caught a whiff of something cold and predatory beneath her expensive perfume. The question is, are you planning to claim your birthright as Empress, or are you content to play house with your Alpha? The ancient book, which had fallen during Seraphina's magical display, suddenly flew back into her hands. Its pages opened to reveal a new image, a great throne room filled with bowing figures, while at its center sat a woman wreathed in silver fire and crystal ice. Above the image, in script that blazed with its own light, were the words, "Every empire begins with a single choice: kneel, or make the world kneel to you." Chapter 6: The Empress's Awakening. The aftermath of power always left Seraphina hollow, as if the magic had burned through more than just energy. It consumed pieces of who she used to be. She sat in Kieran's study, wrapped in his scent and the soft cashmere throw he'd draped around her shoulders, trying to reconcile the woman who'd faced down council enforcers with the librarian she'd been 48 hours ago. "The ley line patterns are still active," Morgana reported, entering with a steaming cup of tea that smelled of moonflowers and something sharper. "The entire estate is now singing, for lack of a better word. The magic you channeled has awakened every protective ward Elena Silvermoon ever laid." Through the study's tall windows, Seraphina could see the evidence. The ancient trees lining the estate's borders glowed faintly silver, and the very air shimmered with residual power. It was beautiful and terrifying. "How long before the council responds?" Kieran asked, his golden eyes never leaving Seraphina's face. He'd been watching her with the intensity of a man afraid his mate might dissolve into moonlight at any moment. "Hours, not days," Morgana replied grimly. "What she displayed this morning, it's not just raw power. It's sovereignty magic, the kind that built and toppled empires in the old days." The ancient book lay open on Kieran's desk, its pages now showing a detailed map of the supernatural world. Lines of power connected various locations, creating a web that pulsed with different colors: silver for witch territories, gold for packlands, deep purple for vampire courts, and crimson for the darker things that preferred not to have names. "Look at this," Seraphina said, tracing one of the silver lines with her finger. Where she touched, the map became three-dimensional, rising from the page like a hologram. All these connections, they all lead back to one place. At the center of the web sat a location marked only as the Heart of Winter, a place where all the ley lines converged in a pattern that hurt to look at directly. "The Silvermoon Sanctuary," Morgana breathed. "It's real." "More than real," Lydia's voice interrupted from the doorway. She'd been conspicuously quiet since the morning's display, but now she entered the study with predatory grace. "It's the seat of power your bloodline held for over 1,000 years, before the Great Purge drove them into hiding." "You seem to know an awful lot about my family history," Seraphina observed, not missing the way Kieran's posture shifted into protective alertness. Lydia's smile was sharp as winter. "I know many things, little witch. For instance, I know the Council of Alphas exists because your ancestors allowed it to. The Silvermoon Empresses ruled the supernatural world for millennia, keeping the peace through a combination of devastating power and political cunning." She moved to the window, gazing out at the still-glowing ley lines. "When the last Empress fell during the Purge, the various factions carved up her territories like vultures. The Council, the vampire courts, the Fey houses, all scrambling for scraps of power that had once belonged to a single bloodline." "Why are you telling me this?" Seraphina asked, though part of her already suspected the answer. "Because change is coming whether you want it or not." Lydia turned back to face them, her ice-blue eyes gleaming with ambition. "The old balance is crumbling. The council grows more tyrannical by the year, the vampire courts are in open civil war, and the Fae have closed their borders entirely. The supernatural world is crying out for strong leadership." The book on the desk flipped to a new page, showing an image that made Seraphina's breath catch. It was her, but not as she was now. This version wore a crown of silver flames and crystal ice, standing before a great throne while representatives of every supernatural species knelt in homage. "The Duality Empress," Lydia said reverently. Fire to destroy what is corrupt, ice to preserve what is worth saving. The perfect ruler for a world in chaos. I don't want to rule anyone, Seraphina protested, but even as she spoke, she could feel something stirring in her blood, an ancient hunger for power, for the ability to shape the world according to her will. What you want and what destiny demands are rarely the same thing, Morgana said gently. But child, the choice must be yours to make. Kieran was suddenly beside her chair, dropping to one knee so his golden eyes were level with hers. Whatever you choose, I'll stand with you. As your mate, your protector, or your consort, however you need me. The casual way he offered to subordinate himself to her authority sent heat spiraling through her chest. This powerful alpha, this man who commanded absolute loyalty from his pack, was willing to kneel to her without hesitation. And if I choose the quiet life? She asked. If I want to find some remote corner of the world where we can just be together? Then we'll find that corner, he said without hesitation. Though I suspect it won't find us. As if summoned by his words, a new sound echoed across the valley. Not the howls of enforcers this time, but something far more ominous. The air itself began to vibrate with power that felt ancient and cold and utterly without mercy. Oh, shit, Lydia breathed, her face going pale. They didn't just report to the council. Who? Kieran demanded, but Seraphina was already moving toward the window. Drawn by a compulsion she couldn't resist. The sky above Raven's Hollow was darkening despite the midday sun, clouds gathering in unnatural spirals that blocked out the light. From within that artificial storm, shapes began to descend, figures in flowing robes that moved with the fluid grace of creatures that had never been entirely human. The ancient council, Morgana whispered, her voice filled with a fear that chilled Seraphina's blood. The original rulers from before the Great Sundering. They've been sleeping for centuries, but if they're waking now, it means they consider me a threat to the old order, Seraphina finished, understanding flooding through her with crystalline clarity. The book in her hands grew suddenly heavy, its pages flipping to a section she'd never seen before. The text that appeared was written in multiple languages, but somehow she understood every word. When the ancient council wakes from their slumber, the world stands at the crossroads of destiny. Submit to their judgment, and the bloodline ends forever. Resist, and embrace the power that is your birthright, but know that once claimed, imperial magic can never be surrendered. The robed figures touched down in the courtyard with ethereal grace, and even from this distance, Seraphina could feel their attention like ice water in her veins. These weren't just powerful supernaturals, they were something older, something that remembered when gods walked the earth. They're here for me, she said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat. Let them come, Kieran growled, his form already beginning to shimmer with the promise of transformation. They'll have to go through me first. And me, Lydia added unexpectedly, moving to stand on Seraphina's other side. I may be ambitious, but I'm not stupid. If the ancients succeed in destroying the Silver Moon bloodline, they'll rule us all with absolute authority. At least with an Empress, there's room for negotiation. Seraphina looked at the two alphas flanking her, one offering love without condition, the other offering alliance born of necessity. Then she looked down at the ancient book, at the image of herself crowned in flame and ice, and felt something shift deep in her soul. The quiet life she dreamed of was never going to be possible. Too many people knew what she was now, and power like hers could never truly hide. The only question was whether she would claim her birthright on her own terms, or let others dictate her fate. Then let's give them. The ancient book slammed shut in her hands, but not before she caught a glimpse of the final page, a prophecy written in blazing script. She who commands both destruction and creation shall either save the supernatural realm, or consume it entirely in righteous flame. Outside, the ancient council began to glow with power that made the air itself scream. Time to find out which prophecy would come true. Chapter 7. The Ancient Judgment. The ancient council moved through Ravenshallow's courtyard like living nightmares, their robes flowing in winds that touched nothing else. There were 7 of them, and each radiated power so old and vast it made Seraphina's bones ache just to look at them. Their faces were hidden beneath deep hoods, but she could feel their attention like physical weight pressing against her consciousness. Child of the lost bloodline. The center figure spoke, and its voice was the sound of glaciers grinding stone, of forests burning, of civilizations falling to dust. You will answer for your presumption. Seraphina stood at the shattered window, Kieran and Lydia flanking her like protective shadows. Below in the courtyard, the Nightshade pack had assembled, not in attack formation, but in witness formation. Whatever happened next would be remembered for generations. I presumed nothing, she called down, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. I simply refused to die quietly. Your ancestors were destroyed for good reason, another ancient intoned, this one's voice like the whisper of wind through crypts. The Silver Moon Empresses grew drunk on power, believing themselves above the natural order. They had to be corrected. The ancient book in her hands grew warm, and without looking down, she knew new text was appearing. She could feel the words burning themselves into her consciousness. The Great Purge was not justice, it was jealousy. The ancients could not bear that mortals had transcended them. Corrected? Heat flared beneath Seraphina's skin, and silver flames began to dance around her fingers. You mean slaughtered. An entire bloodline exterminated because you feared losing control. The lead ancient raised one pale hand, and immediately the air pressure in the valley changed. It became hard to breathe, as if they were suddenly standing at the bottom of an ocean of power. You know nothing of the old ways, pretender. Your kind brought chaos, upset the balance that had existed since the dawn of magic itself. What balance? Seraphina stepped onto the window ledge, her power responding to her growing fury. The one where you ruled from the shadows while the rest of us scrambled for scraps? Behind her, she felt Kieran's tension like a living thing. His wolf was fighting to emerge, driven by the mate bond's demand to protect her at all costs. But this wasn't a battle that could be won with claws and fangs. This was about something far more fundamental. The child shows spirit, the third ancient observed, and there might have been amusement in that terrible voice. Perhaps she is worth testing after all. Testing. Lydia snarled. She just defeated a full contingent of council enforcers without breaking a sweat. What more proof do you need of her power? Power without wisdom is destruction, the lead ancient replied. The old empresses learned this truth too late. We will not repeat that mistake. The ancient raised both hands, and reality began to shift around them. The courtyard dissolved, replaced by a vast chamber carved from what looked like crystallized starlight. Seraphina found herself standing on a dais in the center, while the 7 ancients arranged themselves in a circle around her. Where are we? She demanded, though part of her already knew. The Hall of Judgment, the lead ancient replied, where truth is laid bare and worthiness is measured. Here, your power means nothing. Only the strength of your character can save you now. The chamber filled with images, memories pulled from the depths of her consciousness and projected into the air around them. She saw herself as a child, reading by candlelight while other children played. She saw her years of quiet service in the library, helping countless students find the knowledge they sought. She saw every act of kindness, every moment of doubt, every choice that had shaped her into who she was. But then the images shifted, showing possible futures instead of past truths. She saw herself on a throne of silver flame and crystal ice, ruling the supernatural world with absolute authority. In some visions, she was a benevolent empress, bringing peace and prosperity to all the magical races. In others, she was a tyrant whose wrath consumed entire civilizations. Power corrupts, the second ancient intoned. This is the universal truth. Even those who begin with noble intentions inevitably fall to its seductive whisper. Some do, Seraphina agreed, watching a particularly brutal vision where she reduced a city to ash for the crime of defying her will. But not all. And what makes you different? The third ancient asked. What proof do you offer that you would resist temptation where your ancestors failed? Seraphina looked around the circle of hooded figures, feeling the weight of their judgment like chains around her soul. But beneath that pressure, another feeling was growing, not the wild, chaotic power of her awakening, but something deeper and more controlled. "I don't want to rule," she said simply. "I never asked for this power, never sought this responsibility. But I've learned something important in the past few days." She gestured to where Kieran and Lydia stood at the edge of the chamber, somehow transported here with her, though they seemed frozen in time. Power isn't about what you can do to others. It's about what you choose not to do. I could have killed those enforcers this morning. I could have let the ley line magic consume me and reshaped the world according to my will. Instead, I chose restraint. I chose to protect rather than destroy. "Pretty words," the fourth ancient said dismissively. "But words are wind. Show us the truth of your nature." The chamber changed again, and suddenly Seraphina was standing in a burning city. Around her, people screamed and fled as buildings collapsed in flames. But these weren't strangers. She recognized faces from Raven's Hollow, from her old life. Kieran lay pinned beneath fallen rubble, his golden eyes pleading with her to save him. "Choose," the lead ancient commanded. "Save him, and 1,000 innocents die. Save them, and your mate perishes. This is the burden of power, the impossible choices that break lesser souls." For a moment, Seraphina felt the crushing weight of that decision. Every instinct, every fiber of the mate bond, screamed at her to save Kieran regardless of the cost. But then she remembered the ancient book's teachings, the lessons written in her very blood. "No," she said quietly. "No." The ancient's voice carried surprise. "I refuse your false choice." Silver fire erupted around Seraphina's hands, but this time it was different. Controlled, purposeful, infused with an authority that came from somewhere deeper than mere power. "You're testing me based on the assumption that sacrifice is inevitable, that power always demands innocent blood. But that's your limitation, not mine." She raised both hands, and the burning city around them began to change. Fire still raged, but now it burned only what needed to be destroyed. The rubble trapping Kieran crumbled to ash while leaving him unharmed, the flames consuming disease and corruption while leaving healthy buildings untouched. "Fire doesn't have to be destructive," she continued, ice beginning to spiral around the flames in perfect harmony. "It can be purifying. And ice doesn't have to be cruel. It can preserve what's worth saving." The illusion shattered, and they were back in the Hall of Judgment. But now the 7 ancients were no longer arranged in a circle of judgment. They were kneeling, their hooded heads bowed in recognition of something they hadn't seen in centuries. "Impossible," the lead ancient whispered. "You reshaped the test itself. Only one with true sovereignty magic could." "Could what?" Seraphina demanded, stepping down from the dais to stand before them. "Could prove worthy of the crown of duality," the ancient replied, and for the first time, there was something like awe in that terrible voice. The chamber around them began to glow, and from the crystalline walls emerged a crown unlike anything Seraphina had ever imagined. It was crafted from silver flames that had been somehow crystallized, with points of ice that burned without melting. Just looking at it made her power sing in recognition. "The original crown of the first Empress," the third ancient explained. "Lost when your bloodline fell, hidden until one proved worthy to reclaim it. We never thought." "You never thought a mortal could transcend your expectations," Seraphina finished. She reached for the crown, and the moment her fingers touched it, the world exploded into light and impossible truth. She was standing in the same courtyard where this had all began, but now she could see it as it truly was, not just a physical space, but a nexus point where multiple realities converged. Every choice, every possibility, every potential future spread out before her like a vast web of light. Kieran and Lydia were there, no longer frozen, watching her with expressions of wonder and terror. The crown of duality rested on her head, and she could feel its weight, not just physical, but the weight of every life she would now be responsible for protecting. "My Empress," Kieran said, and in his golden eyes, she saw not just love, but absolute loyalty to the woman she had become. "My queen," Lydia added, dropping to one knee with surprising grace. "Command me." But before Seraphina could respond, the ancient book appeared in her hands one last time. Its pages opened to reveal a final warning, written in script that blazed with prophetic fire. "The crown is claimed, the power awakened, but the true test begins now. For every supernatural being in existence will either kneel to the new Empress or die trying to destroy her." In the distance, carried on winds that suddenly tasted of war and blood, came the sound of armies gathering. The age of the duality Empress had begun. Chapter 8. The Crown's Price. The crown of duality was heavier than starlight and colder than eternity. As it settled onto Seraphina's head, she felt the weight of every supernatural soul in existence pressing against her consciousness, millions of minds suddenly aware that their world had fundamentally changed. "How do you feel?" Kieran asked, his voice carefully controlled. He stood close enough to catch her if she fell, but far enough away to show proper respect for her new station. "Different," she said honestly, testing the word on her tongue. "Like I'm still me, but also more. I can sense them all, every pack, every coven, every court. They know what's happened." Through the crown's power, she could feel the supernatural world's reaction rippling outward like stones thrown into still water. Some responses were immediate submission, ancient bloodlines recognizing the return of legitimate authority. Others blazed with fury and defiance, power-hungry leaders who had grown comfortable in the absence of an empress. And a few were gathering armies. "The Council of Alphas has declared you a false pretender," Lydia reported, checking her phone with the casual efficiency of someone used to monitoring multiple intelligence networks. "They're calling for a united front against what they term the Silver Moon usurpation." "Charming," Seraphina muttered. The crown pulsed with warmth, and suddenly, she could see the council's war room as clearly as if she stood among them, 12 alphas arguing around a table carved from a single piece of obsidian, their faces twisted with rage and fear. 43 packs have already pledged loyalty to the council's cause, she continued, the knowledge flowing through the crown's connection to the supernatural realm. "But 67 have declared for me. And the number is growing." "Civil war," Kieran said grimly. "The supernatural world is splitting down the middle." "No," Seraphina corrected, her voice carrying new authority that made the air itself listen. "Not civil war. Revolution." She moved to the window, looking out over Ravenshallow's grounds where the Nightshade pack had assembled in formation. But now they weren't alone. Other figures were emerging from the surrounding forest, representatives from covens and smaller packs who had felt her ascension and come to witness the new order. "Your Majesty," Morgana said, entering the room with a deep curtsy that somehow managed to convey both respect and affection. "There are delegations requesting audience. The Crescent Moon Coven, the Ironwood Pack, representatives from 3 different vampire courts." "And the Fae?" Seraphina asked, though she already knew the answer through her crown-enhanced awareness. "Silent as always. But their borders have opened for the first time in a century. That's significant." The ancient book materialized in Seraphina's hands, its pages now showing a real-time map of supernatural allegiances. Lines of silver connected those who had sworn to her, while red lines bound those loyal to the council. But there were other colors too. Purple for the vampires' complex court politics, green for Fae neutrality, and darker shades for things that preferred not to declare themselves openly. "We need to move carefully," Kieran said, studying the map over her shoulder. "Power struggles like this tend to get messy." "They're already messy," Seraphina replied, feeling a sudden spike of violence through the crown's connection. 3 packs just went to war in Oregon. The council's supporters are trying to eliminate mine before they can reach us. Lydia's phone buzzed with an incoming call. She answered it with clipped efficiency, but Seraphina could see the growing alarm in her ice-blue eyes. "That was my lieutenant," Lydia said after hanging up. "The council has issued a bounty, $1 million for your head, $500,000 for your capture alive. Every supernatural mercenary on the continent will be hunting us within hours." "Let them come," Seraphina said, and was surprised by the deadly calm in her own voice. I'm done hiding. But even as she spoke, part of her wondered what she was becoming. The woman who had awakened 3 days ago would have been terrified by the prospect of assassins and bounty hunters. This version of herself was already calculating the most efficient ways to eliminate threats. The crown isn't just giving you power, Kieran observed, his golden eyes studying her face with the intensity of a man who knew her better than anyone. It's changing you. All power changes those who wield it, she admitted. The question is whether I change for the better or worse. Through the window, she could see the first delegation approaching, a group of witches in flowing robes, their magic crackling visibly around them like controlled lightning. At their head walked a woman who radiated authority almost equal to Seraphina's own. High Priestess Celeste of the Crescent Moon Coven, Morgana identified. One of the most powerful witches alive, and notoriously difficult to impress. Then let's make a good first impression, Seraphina said, moving toward the door. But Kieran caught her arm gently. Sarah, he said, using the shortened version of her name for the first time since her coronation. Whatever this crown shows you, whatever power it offers, don't lose yourself in it. The woman I fell in love with was extraordinary because of her heart, not her magic. His words hit her like a physical blow, cutting through the crown's intoxicating whispers of absolute authority. For a moment, she saw herself as he did. Not an empress drunk on power, but a woman struggling to do the right thing in impossible circumstances. Thank you, she said quietly, covering his hand with hers. For keeping me grounded. Always, he replied, but she caught the flicker of concern that crossed his features. He was afraid she might be slipping away from him, becoming something too grand and terrible for simple love. The delegation was waiting in Ravenshallow's great hall, 13 witches arranged in a perfect circle, their combined power making the ancient walls hum with resonance. High Priestess Celeste stood at their center, a woman of indeterminate age, with silver hair and eyes like deep forest pools. Your Majesty, she said, offering a curtsy that was respectful but not subservient. The Crescent Moon Coven comes seeking answers. Ask, Seraphina replied, settling into the chair that had once belonged to Kieran's grandfather. The moment she sat, it transformed, simple would becoming a throne of crystallized fire and ice, perfectly attuned to her dual nature. The old empresses ruled through fear, Celeste said bluntly. They demanded absolute obedience and crushed any who dared question their authority. What assurance do we have that you won't repeat their mistakes? It was a fair question, and one Seraphina had been asking herself since claiming the crown. I can't give you assurances, she said honestly. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. All I can promise is that I'll try to be better than my predecessors, and that I'll listen to voices like yours when they remind me of my humanity. Celeste's eyes widened slightly. You admit the possibility of corruption? Of course. Anyone who claims they're immune to power's influence is either lying or delusional. Seraphina leaned forward, meeting the High Priestess's gaze directly. But I have something the old empresses didn't, people who love me enough to call me out when I go too far. Her eyes found Kieran's across the room, and she saw his smile of approval. That small gesture of connection did more to anchor her humanity than all the crown's whispered promises of godlike authority. An interesting perspective, Celeste mused. Very well. The Crescent Moon Coven pledges its support to the Duality Empress, with one condition. Which is that you swear a binding oath to never use your power to harm innocent supernatural beings. Any who haven't taken up arms against you remain under our protection. It was a clever trap, binding her power while appearing to support her authority. But Seraphina found herself nodding anyway. Agreed. But I reserve the right to define innocent for myself. Celeste smiled, apparently satisfied with the negotiation. Then we are your loyal subjects, Your Majesty. The formal words triggered something in the crown, and suddenly Seraphina could feel the Crescent Moon Coven's power flowing into hers, not subsumed or dominated, but willingly shared. It was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. As the witches filed out to spread word of their allegiance, Lydia approached with a grim expression. The council has made their move, she said, holding up her phone. They've declared you an enemy of all supernatural kind and are mobilizing for full-scale war. But that's not the worst part. What's the worst part? Lydia's smile was sharp with anticipation and fear. They've awakened the Titan wolves. The crown pulsed with sudden, terrible knowledge. The Titan wolves, ancient creatures from the world's dawn, each one the size of a building and possessed of power that could level mountains. The council had promised never to wake them except in cases of absolute emergency. How many? Seraphina asked, though she dreaded the answer. 3, Kieran replied, his face pale with the implications. 1 for each of the old strongholds. They're marching toward territories loyal to you. Through the crown's connection, Seraphina could sense them, massive, primordial presences moving across the continent like walking earthquakes. In 6 hours, they would reach the first target. In 12, they would be unstoppable. Then we have a choice, she said, standing from her throne with grim determination. Surrender to the council's ultimatum, or prove that the age of the duality Empress is more than just pretty words. The crown blazed with silver fire and crystal ice, and for the first time since claiming it, Seraphina felt the full weight of imperial responsibility. War was coming, and she was the only thing standing between the supernatural world and absolute tyranny. The question was, would claiming that power to protect others damn her soul in the process? Chapter 9, Titans of War. The first Titan wolf reached the Moonhaven Sanctuary at dawn, and Seraphina felt every death through her crown's connection like knives in her soul. She stood on Ravenshollow's highest tower, her hands pressed against the stone battlements as waves of anguish crashed through her consciousness. 300 witches and their families lived at Moonhaven, had lived, until 20 minutes ago when a creature the size of a cathedral had torn through their protective wards like tissue paper. We have to do something, she said, her voice rough with unshed tears. Below in the courtyard, refugees were still arriving, survivors from smaller territories who had fled before the council's advance. We are doing something, Kieran replied, moving to stand beside her. The evacuation of the northern territories is almost complete. We've saved thousands. By running, she said bitterly. By letting the council's monsters slaughter anyone too slow to flee. The ancient book appeared in her hands, its pages showing tactical assessments that made her stomach clench. The 3 Titan wolves were unstoppable forces of nature, each one bound to an alpha's will but possessing intelligence and power that dated back to the world's creation. Traditional military strategies were useless against them. There's another way, she said suddenly, studying a passage that glowed with desperate hope. The old empresses faced Titan wolves before, during the War of 7 Moons. They found a way to stop them. How? Lydia asked, appearing at the tower's entrance with reports from her intelligence network. According to the historical records, those battles lasted decades and devastated half the continent. Imperial binding, Seraphina read from the book. A technique that allows an empress to override the Titans' loyalty bonds and turn them against their masters. But the cost. She trailed off, the words on the page making her blood run cold. Imperial binding required the Empress to pour her life force into the working, burning years from her natural lifespan to fuel the magic. The last Empress who attempted it had aged 50 years in a single day. What cost? Kieran demanded, his golden eyes reading the fear on her face. Nothing we can afford, she said quietly, but even as she spoke, another wave of death reached her through the crown. The second Titan wolf had reached the Silverback territories, and the ancient pack that had ruled the Pacific Northwest for 8 centuries was being systematically annihilated. Your Majesty, came Morgana's voice from the tower stairs. The elderly wolf was breathing hard from the climb, but her expression was grimmer than exhaustion could account for. We've received a message from the council. They're offering terms. Terms? Seraphina turned, though part of her attention remained fixed on the distant battles raging across the continent. Complete surrender within 12 hours, Morgana continued. You abdicate the crown, submit to binding that will prevent you from accessing Silvermoon magic ever again, and accept exile to a realm where you can never return to this world. And in exchange, they call off the Titan wolves and spare the territories that have declared for you. Morgana's voice was carefully neutral, but Seraphina could hear the underlying message. This was the rational choice, the one that would save the most lives. It's a trap, Lydia said immediately. The moment she surrenders, they'll have us all killed. The council can't afford to leave enemies alive. Maybe, Kieran agreed. But they also can't afford to rule over a wasteland. The Titan wolves are causing too much destruction. They're eliminating the very populations the council wants to control. Through her crown's connection, Seraphina could sense the truth of his words. The supernatural world was hemorrhaging power and resources, with each territory destroyed. The council had overplayed their hand, using weapons too destructive for their ultimate goals. Which gave her an idea. What if we don't have to choose between surrender and imperial binding, she said, studying the tactical map the book had conjured. What if there's a third option? Such as? Lydia asked skeptically. We turn the council's own strategy against them. Seraphina pointed to the book's illustration of a Titan wolf in full rampage. Look at this. The binding that controls them requires constant reinforcement from their alpha controllers. It's not a leash so much as a continuous magical connection. And, Kieran prompted, though she could see understanding beginning to dawn in his golden eyes. And magical connections work both ways. If I can't override the Titan's loyalty, maybe I can use that connection to reach their controllers directly. The book's pages flipped to a new section, showing complex magical formulas that hurt to look at directly. But beneath the arcane symbols, the core concept was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of trying to dominate the Titans, she would use them as conduits to strike at the Alphas commanding them. That's... Lydia paused, working through the implications. Actually brilliant, but the power requirements would be enormous. You'd need to channel more raw magic than any single person has ever attempted. Not any single person, Seraphina corrected, looking at the two alphas who had become the anchors of her new existence. But maybe not alone. Understanding flashed across Kieran's face. Mate bond amplification. You want to channel power through our connection. Through both connections, she said, meeting Lydia's ice-blue eyes. You swore loyalty to me, which created its own form of bond. Between the three of us, we might have enough combined power to pull this off. Might, Lydia repeated dryly. And if we're wrong? Then we die trying, instead of living as exiles while innocents are slaughtered. Seraphina moved to the center of the tower, the crown of duality blazing with silver fire and crystal ice as her power responded to her determination. I won't let the council turn me into a weapon of surrender. Kieran was already moving to her right side, his form beginning to shimmer with the promise of transformation. What do you need from me? Everything, she said simply. I need you to open your connection to your pack, to every wolf you've ever commanded or protected. I need to borrow their strength. He nodded without hesitation, dropping to one knee as his human shape gave way to the massive alpha wolf that was his true form. Even shifted, his golden eyes remained fixed on her face with absolute trust and love. Lydia took longer to decide, her calculating gaze weighing the risks against potential rewards. But finally, she moved to Seraphina's left side and began her own transformation, revealing a wolf form that was smaller than Kieran's but radiated lethal grace and icy power. I hope you know what you're doing, Empress, she said, though her shifted vocal cords made the words come out as growls that somehow still conveyed meaning. So do I, Seraphina admitted, and began to gather power. The mate bond with Kieran opened first, flowing between them like liquid starlight. Through it, she could feel not just his strength, but the strength of every Nightshade wolf, hundreds of connections forming a network of shared power. Then Lydia's loyalty bond activated, bringing with it the cold efficiency of the Shadowmere pack and their ice magic traditions. But it still wasn't enough. She could feel the distant Titan wolves like massive shadows on her consciousness, their power dwarfing even her enhanced abilities. We need more, she gasped, sweat beading on her forehead as she struggled to contain the conflicting energies. The covens that have pledged loyalty. Can you reach them? Through the crown's connection, She felt the answer before either Alpha could respond. The magical bonds of allegiance were activating one by one, every supernatural being who had sworn to her cause suddenly becoming a conduit for shared power. The Crescent Moon Coven, the smaller packs, even individual witches and wolves scattered across the continent, all contributing to a network of power unlike anything the world had ever seen. Now, she breathed and unleashed the combined might of her growing empire. The spell shot out from Raven's Hollow like a silver comet, racing across the continent at the speed of thought. But instead of targeting the Titan wolves directly, it followed the magical leashes back to their controllers, 3 ancient alphas who had bound these creatures to their will centuries ago. The first connection hit Alpha Grimjaw in his stronghold in the Rocky Mountains. Through the link, Seraphina felt a shock and terror as the full weight of her borrowed power crashed into his consciousness. The Titan wolf he commanded stumbled mid-rampage, its connection to its master suddenly flooded with competing commands. "Submit," she whispered across impossible distances, her voice carrying the authority of an empress backed by hundreds of loyal souls. "Release your monster and submit to the true order." Grimjaws will crumble like sand. The Titan wolf in the northern territories collapsed, its artificial rage fading as ancient bindings snapped. Through her crown, she felt the creature's vast relief as it was finally freed from centuries of forced servitude. The second and third alphas fell in rapid succession, their control over their respective titans shattered by power they couldn't hope to match. Within minutes, all 3 ancient creatures had been released from bondage and were wandering away from the territories they'd been destroying, seeking whatever peace creatures of their kind could find. But the backlash hit Seraphina like a physical blow. Channeling that much power through the alliance bonds had cost her. She could feel the network beginning to fray, some connections severing under the strain. Several dozen of her supporters had burned out their magical cores entirely, and the guilt of that sacrifice added weight to her already exhausted consciousness. She collapsed to her knees on the tower's stone floor, the crown of duality flickering as her power reserves hit dangerous lows. But through the haze of exhaustion, she felt something else: silence from the Council's territories, followed by the distinctive magical signature of emergency meetings being called. It worked, she managed, though speaking took tremendous effort. The Titans are free. The Council's ultimate weapons are gone. Kieran and Lydia shifted back to human form, both looking nearly as drained as she felt. But there was something like awe in their expressions as they helped her to her feet. "Do you realize what you just accomplished?" Lydia asked. "You coordinated a magical working across an entire continent, using people you'd never met as willing conduits. That's not just Empress-level magic. That's godlike." The ancient book materialized in Seraphina's hands one final time, its pages now showing the aftermath of her victory. Across the supernatural world, power structures were shifting. Smaller factions were declaring for her in droves, sensing that the winds of change had become a hurricane. Even some council loyalists were beginning to waver, unwilling to follow leaders who had lost control of their ultimate weapons. But on the last page, a warning appeared in blazing script. "Victory in battle is not victory in war. The council grows desperate, and desperate enemies are the most dangerous of all." As if summoned by the prophecy, Morgana's voice echoed up from the courtyard below. "Your Majesty." Emergency delegation approaching from the south, council envoys under a flag of truce. Seraphina straightened, ignoring the exhaustion that made her bones ache. The crown of duality might have flickered, but it had not fallen. She was still Empress, still the last hope for a supernatural world on the brink of chaos. And now the real negotiations were about to begin. Chapter 10. The Devil's Bargain. The council's delegation arrived at sunset, their black motorcycles cutting through Ravenshallow's evening mists like harbingers of Judgment Day. Seraphina watched from her throne in the Great Hall as 12 figures dismounted in perfect synchronization, the full membership of the Council of Alphas, come to negotiate in person rather than risk further magical surprises. "Bold of them," Kieran murmured from his position at her right hand. "Or desperate." "Both," Lydia said from her left. "Look at their formation. They're arranged for rapid retreat, not confident negotiation. Seraphina studied the approaching delegation through the crown's enhanced perception, reading the subtle signs of their emotional states. Fear dominated. Fear of her power, fear of losing control, but also fear of something else. Something that made their terror of her seem almost secondary. There's more at stake here than just our conflict, she realized. They're afraid of something bigger than losing to me. The Great Hall's doors opened, and the Council of Alphas filed in with the predatory grace of apex predators entering foreign territory. At their head walked Alpha Supreme Marcus Ironwood, a man whose presence filled rooms and whose authority had gone unchallenged for 3 decades. But now his silver hair was streaked with premature white, and lines of stress carved his face like battle scars. "Your Imperial Majesty," he said, offering a bow that was precisely calculated to show respect without subservience. "We come under flag of truce to discuss terms." "Terms of surrender?" Seraphina asked, though she kept her voice neutral. The crown whispered that showing weakness now would invite aggression, but her conscience demanded she give them a chance for peaceful resolution. "Terms of coexistence," Ironwood corrected. "The supernatural world has been shaken by recent events. Perhaps accommodation can be reached." Behind him, the other 11 alphas arranged themselves in a loose semicircle. Seraphina recognized several from intelligence reports: Alpha Shadowbane of the Eastern Territories, Alpha Stormdancer of the Great Lakes region, Alpha Bloodmoon from the Southern Marshlands. Each one commanded hundreds of wolves and controlled territory larger than entire human nations. "Speak your terms," she said, settling back in her throne of crystallized fire and ice. Ironwood stepped forward, his hands clasped behind his back in a gesture that could have been diplomatic or defensive. "The Council proposes a division of authority. You retain sovereignty over the magical bloodlines, witches, seers, and other non-pack supernaturals. We maintain authority over werewolf territories and pack law. 2 separate but equal powers, with defined spheres of influence." It was a clever offer, one that acknowledged her strength while preserving the Council's core power base. But Seraphina could sense the trap hidden within seemingly reasonable terms. "And disputes between our separate but equal powers?" she asked. "When pack law conflicts with imperial decree, who arbitrates?" "A joint tribunal," Alpha Shadowbane interjected, her scarred face impassive. "Half council representatives, half imperial appointees. Majority rules. With the council controlling numerical advantage through your tributary packs," Lydia observed coldly. "Clever, but transparent." Ironwood's expression tightened. "We offer compromise in good faith, Your Majesty. The alternative benefits no one." "What alternative?" Seraphina leaned forward, her power causing the air to shimmer with barely contained energy. "You've lost your Titan wolves, lost the support of half the supernatural community. What makes you think you're negotiating from a position of strength?" The 12 alphas exchanged glances, and she caught a flicker of something darker than political calculation. These weren't just leaders protecting their territory, they were terrified of something specific. "Because," Ironwood said quietly, "our conflict has attracted attention from parties who make even your power seem limited." The ancient book appeared in Seraphina's hands unbidden, its pages flying open to reveal imagery that made her blood run cold. Ancient symbols, geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly, and beneath them a single word in script that seemed to writhe on the page: primordial. "The old ones are stirring," Alpha Bloodmoon said, his voice carrying the weight of prophecy. "The magical disruptions from our war, the breaking of ancient power structures, the awakening of silver moon magic, it's created ripples that reach into realms better left undisturbed." Through her crown's connection, Seraphina suddenly felt them. Vast, alien intelligences pressing against the boundaries of reality like cosmic sharks scenting blood in the water. Things that existed before the first supernatural beings learned to shapeshift, before magic had rules and limitations. "The primordials," she whispered, understanding flooding through her. "The first powers, from before gods and mortals divided the world between them." "They've been sleeping for eons," Ironwood confirmed. "But power calls to power, and the level of magic you've been channeling, It's like ringing a dinner bell for entities that consider our entire realm a light snack. The implications hit her like a physical blow. Her victory over the Titan wolves, the continental-spanning power network she'd created, even claiming the crown of duality, all of it had been sending signals into the cosmic void, advertising the presence of significant magical power to beings that viewed reality itself as a resource to be consumed. "How long?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "Our seers estimate 3 days before the first scouts break through," Alpha Stormdancer replied. "A week before the main force arrives. After that..." He shrugged eloquently. "After that, arguments about political authority become rather academic," Ironwood concluded. "The primordials don't negotiate, don't compromise, and don't leave survivors. They simply consume everything with magical potential and move on." Kieran's hand found hers, his warmth anchoring her as the weight of cosmic threat settled over her consciousness. "So, what are you proposing?" "That we unite our forces." "More than unite," Ironwood said. "We propose the compact of last resort, a complete merger of supernatural authority under emergency protocol. All territorial disputes suspended, all resources pooled, all power structures subordinated to a single command authority." "Under whose command?" Seraphina asked, though she suspected she knew. "Yours," Ironwood admitted, and the word came out like he was swallowing poison. "The Empress holds the only magic powerful enough to potentially stand against primordial forces. The crown of duality gives you access to both creation and destruction on a scale that might be sufficient to protect our realm." The offer hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Complete authority over the supernatural world, but only because she was potentially their last hope against cosmic annihilation. It was the ultimate devil's bargain. Unlimited power in exchange for impossible responsibility. "And if I refuse?" she asked. "Then we die separately instead of together," Alpha Shadowbane said with brutal honesty. "But we still die. The primordials won't distinguish between council and imperial territories when they begin harvesting." Through the crown's connection, Seraphina could sense the truth of their words. The alien presences pressing against reality's boundaries were vast beyond comprehension, their hunger for magical energy absolute and undiscerning. Every supernatural being on Earth wouldn't provide more than an appetizer for entities that fed on the life force of entire dimensions. "I need guarantees," she said finally. "Full access to council resources, complete tactical cooperation, and binding oaths that this authority doesn't revert after the crisis passes." "Done," Ironwood said without hesitation. "Though I suspect if we survive this, questions of long-term governance will seem rather trivial." "Then we have an accord." Seraphina stood, the crown of duality blazing with power that made every alpha in the room take an involuntary step backward. "But understand this. I won't sacrifice innocent lives for tactical advantage. If I'm taking responsibility for protecting this realm, I'll do it on my terms." "Your terms are acceptable," Ironwood replied, dropping to one knee. Around him, the other 11 alphas followed suit, their submission carrying the weight of binding magical oath. "All hail the Empress of all supernaturals, protector of the realm, last hope against the dark." The formal words triggered something deep within the crown, and suddenly Seraphina could feel every supernatural being on Earth, millions of connections flowing into her consciousness like tributaries feeding a vast river. The sheer scope of it was overwhelming, intoxicating, and terrifying. But beneath that expanded awareness, she could also sense the approaching threat more clearly. The primordials were indeed coming, drawn by the magical beacon her ascension had created. And they brought with them a hunger that could consume not just the supernatural world, but reality itself. "God help us all," she whispered and meant it. Through the great hall's windows, the first stars were appearing in the evening sky. But to her enhanced perception, they looked wrong somehow, as if the very fabric of space was beginning to warp under the influence of approaching entities too vast for normal reality to contain. The war for supernatural succession was over. The battle for existence itself was about to begin. Chapter 11. The Empire's Heart. The war room beneath Raven's Hollow had been carved from living bedrock 3 centuries ago, but now it hummed with technology that would have seemed like magic to its original builders. Holographic displays showed real-time magical energy readings from across the globe, while communication crystals linked her to supernatural leaders on every continent. The merger of ancient power and modern innovation, exactly what they would need to face cosmic-level threats. Status report, Seraphina commanded, her voice carrying easily across the bustling chamber. The crown had grown heavier over the past 24 hours, its weight increasing with each new connection to her rapidly expanding empire. North American territories are at 92% integration, reported Alpha Ironwood, his former antagonism replaced by grim professionalism. South America is slower. The Jaguar shifters are traditionalists, but they'll comply rather than face the primordials alone. Europe? She asked, studying the tactical displays that showed power distribution across the Atlantic. The vampire courts have agreed to contribute their blood magic to the defensive network, Lydia answered, consulting reports from her expanded intelligence network. The Fae remain.
Fae.
They've promised aid, but won't specify what form it will take. Seraphina nodded absently, most of her attention focused on the crown's enhanced awareness. Through millions of supernatural minds, she could sense the approaching wrongness, reality itself beginning to buckle under the influence of entities that existed outside normal space and time. Kieran, she said, turning to where her mate stood studying satellite imagery of the ocean boundaries. The coastal defenses? Every pack with territory touching water has been repositioned, he replied, moving to her side with the fluid grace that had first captivated her. But Sarah, if these things can cross dimensional barriers, I'm not sure physical positioning matters. He was right, and they both knew it. The primordials weren't invading in any conventional sense. They were bleeding through reality's weakest points, drawn by magical energy, like cosmic moths to a supernatural flame. Traditional military tactics were useless against enemies that could exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Then we don't fight them conventionally, she said, an idea beginning to form. Show me the ley line convergences again. The holographic display shifted, revealing the planet's magical infrastructure in glowing detail. Lines of power crisscrossed every continent, forming nodes where multiple currents intersected. But there was a pattern there, something she'd been too focused on immediate threats to notice before. Look at this, she murmured, tracing connections with her finger. The major convergence points, they're not random. They form a geometric pattern. Morgana approached from her position coordinating evacuation efforts, her ancient eyes studying the display with growing recognition. A binding circle, she breathed. Planet scale. Binding what? Alpha Blood Moon asked, though his scarred features suggested he suspected the answer. The barriers between dimensions, Seraphina replied, understanding flooding through her crown-enhanced consciousness. The ley lines aren't just conduits for magical energy, they're reinforcement structures, keeping reality stable against intrusion from elsewhere. Which explained why the primordials were coming now. Her continental-spanning power network, her battle against the Titan wolves, the very act of claiming the crown of duality, all of it had stressed the planetary binding circle beyond its limits. She hadn't just attracted cosmic predators, she'd weakened the very defenses designed to keep them out. How long before complete breach? She asked, though part of her dreaded the answer. At current degradation rates? Morgana consulted calculations that made even her immortal composure crack. 18 hours. Maybe less. The war room fell silent except for the hum of magical machinery and the distant sound of refugees still arriving in Ravenshallow's courtyard. 18 hours to find a solution that had eluded the planet's original magical architects, using resources cobbled together from former enemies and reluctant. There has to be something, Kieran said fiercely. Some way to reinforce the barriers, buy us more time. The ancient book materialized in Seraphina's hands, its pages automatically opening to a section she'd never seen before. The illustrations showed the planet's creation, when the first supernatural beings had worked together to establish the dimensional locks that would protect their new home. The original compact, she read aloud. when the first Empress united all magical races to create the planetary defenses. But it required. She trailed off, the implications making her stomach clench. Required what? Lydia demanded. A willing sacrifice from the apex of each magical bloodline. The Empress gave her life to anchor the binding, while representatives from every other race contributed their essential life force. The barriers weren't just magical constructs, they were powered by the voluntary sacrifice of the supernatural community's greatest leaders. The room's silence took on a different quality. Not just shock, but recognition of what she was suggesting. "You're not seriously considering," Kieran began, but she cut him off with a look. "I'm considering every option. If the original barriers were powered by voluntary sacrifice, maybe we can reinforce them the same way." "The original ceremony killed everyone involved," Morgana pointed out with grim practicality. "That's rather a significant drawback to the plan." "Not everyone," Seraphina corrected, studying the book's detailed diagrams. "The Empress survived, but she was changed. Bound to the planetary defenses, existing partially in multiple dimensions. More force of nature than individual person." She could feel Kieran's horror through their mate bond, his wolf's instinctive rejection of anything that threatened to take her away from him. But she could also sense his understanding. If the choice was between her sacrifice and cosmic annihilation, there was no choice at all. "There has to be another way," he said desperately. "Maybe there is." The voice came from the chamber's entrance, where a figure in flowing robes waited with the patient stillness of someone who had just arrived from very far away. Every supernatural in the room turned, hands moving to weapons by instinct. But Seraphina felt only recognition through her crown's awareness. This newcomer was powerful, ancient, and oddly familiar. "Lady Nightwhisper of the Winter Court," the figure said, lowering her hood to reveal features that belonged in classical sculptures, perfect, ageless, and touched with the otherworldly beauty that marked the High Fae. "I bring greetings from the courts of air and darkness, and, perhaps, a solution to your dilemma." "The Fae," Alpha Shadowbane spat. "Where were you when we needed allies? When the Council was mobilizing Titan wolves?" Lady Nightwhisper's smile was sharp as winter stars. "Preparing for this moment. The Fae have dealt with primordial incursions before, though not on this scale. We know methods that don't require the extinction of leadership." "Such as?" Seraphina asked, though she kept her voice carefully neutral. "Dealing with Fae always required precise language and careful thinking." "The Eternal Compact," Lady Nightwhisper replied. "Instead of sacrifice to power the barriers, we propose symbiosis. A permanent bond between the planetary defenses and the supernatural community's apex leader. You would become the living anchor for dimensional stability, immortal, but constrained to remain within the realm you're protecting." It was better than death, but barely. Immortal imprisonment, bound to the planet as a living component of its magical defenses. She would survive, but she would never be fully human again, never be able to live the quiet life she'd once dreamed of. "And the cost to everyone else?" she asked. "Significantly less than mass sacrifice. Each supernatural leader contributes a portion of their power to the binding, weakening them but not killing them. The result is a more stable, self-sustaining defense network." Kieran stepped closer, his hand finding hers. "And mates of the anchoring Empress?" Lady Nightwhisper's expression softened slightly. "The mate bond is strong enough to transcend dimensional barriers. You would remain connected, though the nature of that connection would evolve." Through their link, Seraphina felt Kieran's complex emotional response, grief for the normal life they would lose, pride in her willingness to sacrifice for others, and beneath it all, absolute determination to stand by her regardless of the cost. "How long do we have to decide?" she asked. "The ritual must begin within 12 hours to have any chance of success," Lady Nightwhisper replied. "And every supernatural leader must participate willingly. Any hesitation, any doubt, and the binding will fail catastrophically." Seraphina looked around the war room at the faces of former enemies turned desperate allies. These beings had spent centuries fighting each other for scraps of power and territory. Now she was asking them to voluntarily weaken themselves for the abstract concept of dimensional stability. I need to address the full assembly, she decided. Everyone needs to understand what we're asking and why. Your Imperial Majesty, Alpha Ironwood said formally. Whatever you decide, the Council stands behind you. Similar pledges came from around the room. Alphas, Coven leaders, vampire representatives, and others all offering their support for whatever impossible choice lay ahead. But as they prepared to address the largest gathering of supernatural leaders in history, Seraphina caught sight of herself in the polished metal surface of a control panel. The crown of duality blazed around her head like a stellar corona, and her eyes held depths that seemed to reflect cosmic distances. She was already changing, already becoming something more and less than human. The question was whether she could complete that transformation in time to save the world that had made her what she was. Outside, reality itself was beginning to fray at the edges. They were running out of time. Chapter 12. The Eternal Empress. The great amphitheater carved into Ravensshallow's mountainside had never hosted a gathering like this. Representatives from every supernatural species on Earth filled the ancient stone seats, werewolves sitting beside vampires, witches sharing space with fey nobles, and dozens of other magical beings who normally avoided each other's territories entirely. At the amphitheater's heart, a massive ritual circle had been inscribed in silver and starlight, its geometric patterns designed to channel power on a planetary scale. Seraphina stood at the circle's center, the crown of duality blazing like a captured star above her head. Through her enhanced awareness, she could feel the approaching wrongness pressing against reality's weakening barriers, vast intelligences that viewed their entire dimension as nothing more than a convenient snack. The time for debate is over, she announced, her voice carrying to every corner of the amphitheater without need for amplification. The primordials will breach our dimensional barriers within hours. We can face them divided and be consumed, or we can forge something new, an eternal compact that binds us all in defense of our shared reality. Murmurs rippled through the assembled crowd, representatives of ancient bloodlines discussing the implications in dozens of languages. But beneath the political calculations, she could sense a deeper current, genuine fear of the cosmic threat, combined with growing faith in her leadership. The Eternal Compact will transform me into a living anchor for our world's defenses, she continued, her words carrying the weight of absolute truth. I will become immortal but bound to this realm, existing partially in multiple dimensions to reinforce the barriers that keep darker things at bay. In exchange, each of your bloodlines contributes a portion of your power to the binding, weakening yourselves but creating something stronger than the sum of its parts. Lady Nightwhisper stepped forward from her position among the Fey delegation, moonlight seeming to bend around her ethereal form. The Winter Court pledges the frost of eternal stars to the compact. The Summer Court offers the fire of the living sun, called another Fey noble, his voice carrying the warmth of endless summer days. One by one, the supernatural leaders rose to pledge their participation. Alpha Ironwood spoke for the werewolves, High Priestess Celeste for the witches, Lord Darkwood for the vampire courts. Even representatives of the more secretive magical races, the Jinn, the dragon-blooded, the keepers of ancient secrets, added their voices to the growing chorus of commitment. But Seraphina's attention was focused on Kieran, who stood at the ritual circle's edge with an expression that mixed pride, love, and barely contained anguish. Through their mate bond, she could feel his internal struggle, his wolf's need to protect her warring with his human understanding that this was the only path forward. Kieran, she said softly, though her voice still carried to every listening ear. I need you to know that whatever I become, whatever changes the compact brings, my love for you will remain constant. The mate bond transcends dimensional boundaries. He stepped into the circle, his golden eyes reflecting starlight and tears in equal measure. I know. And I need you to know that I'll find a way to reach you, no matter how many realities separate us. Their hands met in the circle's center, and immediately the carved patterns began to glow with power drawn from every pledged supernatural being in the amphitheater. Silver fire and crystal ice spiraled around them, but now the opposing elements danced in perfect harmony. Creation and preservation united in purpose. "I love you," Kieran whispered against her lips as he kissed her one last time as fully human beings. "I love you too," she replied, and felt their words become part of the ritual itself, weaving the mate bond into the planetary defenses they were about to forge. Lady Nightwhisper began the formal incantation, her voice weaving together syllables that predated human language. Around the amphitheater, every supernatural being joined in, their combined will focusing on the ritual circle where Seraphina stood with her arms raised to embrace destiny. Power flowed into her from thousands of sources, not overwhelming this time, but carefully controlled and precisely channeled. She felt her human form beginning to change, not into something monstrous, but into something more. Her consciousness expanded beyond the boundaries of flesh, touching the ley lines that circled the globe, feeling the weak points where cosmic predators pressed against reality's membrane. The crown of duality dissolved, its power flowing into her very being until she became a living embodiment of the forces she'd once struggled to control. Fire and ice, creation and preservation, mortal love and immortal duty, all of it balanced within a form that existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions. Through her expanded awareness, she felt the exact moment when the planetary barriers snapped back into place, stronger than they had been in millennia. The approaching primordials crashed against defenses that no longer relied on ancient architecture, but on the living will of an entire supernatural community united in purpose. Their cosmic hunger turned to surprise, then frustration, then gradual retreat as they realized this realm was no longer vulnerable to casual predation. The barriers would hold, not just for years or centuries, but for as long as the supernatural community remained united in their commitment to defend their shared home. But the victory came with its promised price. Seraphina could feel her consciousness settling into its new configuration, still herself, but expanded beyond anything resembling normal human existence. She was the planet's immune system now, a living sensor network that would detect and counter any threat to dimensional stability. "Sarah?" Kieran's voice reached her across impossible distances, carried by a mate bond that had evolved to transcend space and time. "I'm here," she replied, though her voice now carried harmonics that spoke to the music of spheres. "Changed, but still yours." Around the amphitheater, the assembled supernatural beings were rising to their feet in waves, offering formal obeisance to their new eternal Empress. But through her enhanced perception, she could feel that their submission was genuine, born not of fear but of gratitude for the impossible choice she had made. "What happens now?" Alpha Ironwood asked, his voice carrying a respect that would have been impossible to imagine just days earlier. "Now we build something better than what came before," Seraphina replied, her expanded consciousness already cataloging the improvements possible with a truly united supernatural community. "No more council tyranny, no more ancient prejudices dividing us. We have work to do." The ancient book appeared in the air before her, its pages now showing not prophecies of potential futures, but blueprints for the golden age they would build together. Schools where young supernatural beings could learn about their heritage without fear, hospitals where magical healing could benefit both supernatural and human communities, research centers where the greatest minds of every magical species could collaborate on questions that had puzzled them for millennia. "The Duality Empire," she said, the name carrying the weight of destiny fulfilled. "Where opposing forces find balance, where ancient enemies become eternal allies." As the sun rose over Raven's Hollow, painting the amphitheater in shades of gold and silver, Seraphina felt the last pieces of her transformation settling into place. She was no longer the quiet librarian who had once dreamed of simple happiness, but neither was she the tyrant her predecessors had become. She was something new, an empress whose power was tempered by love, whose immortality was grounded in service to others, whose strength came not from domination but from willing unity. And through the mate bond that would never break, she felt Kieran's love surrounding her like a warm embrace, reminding her that even gods need someone to come home to. The age of the Eternal Empress had begun, and with it, a new chapter in the history of magic itself. Far below in the valley, children were already being born who would grow up in a world where supernatural and human could coexist openly, where ancient powers served the cause of justice rather than personal ambition, where love could transcend even the boundaries of reality itself. It was a future worth every sacrifice that had brought it into being. And it was only the beginning. 6 months later, the imperial palace materialized from silver mist and starlight on what had once been empty ground in the Swiss Alps, its crystalline spires reaching toward dimensions only Seraphina could perceive. Here, at the intersection of multiple ley lines, she held court in a throne room that existed simultaneously in 3 different realities. Representatives from across the supernatural world came here to petition for aid, to report on the progress of integration projects, or simply to bask in the presence of an empress whose power had become legend. But her favorite moments were the quiet times between formal audiences, when she could focus her consciousness back into a single dimension and spend precious hours with the man who had chosen to follow her into immortality. The Fae courts are requesting permission to establish permanent embassies in the human cities, Kieran reported, settling into the chair that had appeared beside her throne the moment he'd accepted his role as imperial consort. Apparently, they're fascinated by modern art. Approved, Seraphina said, though most of her attention was focused on the way afternoon light played across his features. He'd changed too over the past months, their bond allowing him to share in some aspects of her expanded existence. He aged more slowly now, could sense dimensional fluctuations, and possessed a connection to the planetary defense network that made him her perfect partner in both love and governance. And the vampire courts want to know if you'd consider mediating their dispute over territorial boundaries in Eastern Europe. Schedule it for next week. After we deal with a dragon who's decided to relocate to Scotland without consulting the local authorities. Busy schedule for someone who used to organize library books, he observed with a smile that still made her heart race across multiple dimensions. I had good training in dealing with difficult personalities, she replied, leaning over to kiss him with lips that tasted of starlight and promises kept. Through the palace windows, she could see delegations from a dozen different species making their way up the mountain paths, coming to participate in the new world they were building together. It wasn't perfect. Nothing involving this many powerful personalities could be, but it was better than anything that had come before. And in the quiet moments between cosmic responsibilities, when she could focus her vast consciousness down to the simple pleasure of holding hands with the man she loved, Seraphina knew that some fairy tales really did come true, even if they required becoming a god to achieve them. The end.